First, women by the numbers. Then, creation, equality, and Ezar. Third, prophets, leaders, and heroines. Fourth, the women in ministry debate. And finally, cultural versus timeless context. Let's get into it.
Starting right off with Section 1, Women by the Numbers, in the Old and New Testaments. You know, a really common misconception is that women are mostly absent, or at best, barely visible in ancient historical and religious texts. But the data? Well, it tells a completely different story. When we actually sit down and crunch the numbers, a pretty fascinating picture emerges. In the Old Testament alone, the text explicitly records 133 named women. Now add to that 90 unnamed women who are specifically referenced, plus 145 groups of unnamed women. That brings us to a staggering 368 women identified in the Old Testament, and that's not even mentioning the hundreds of parables and prophecies that specifically include women. Fast forward to the New Testament, and the text adds another 77 women to our data set. So we're looking at 33 specific named women, alongside 28 unnamed women in various groups, plus another 60 specific parables or prophecies involving them.
So when we put all this together, a massive picture emerges. We're talking about 445 specific women documented in these texts. That sheer volume is huge, and it sets the stage for something even more interesting: the incredibly diverse and, quite frankly, powerful roles these women occupied in their ancient societies.
Out of those 445 women, our source data highlights 75 standout high-status positions. Look at this breakdown: 19 prophets, 15 survivors, 14 princesses, 14 heroines, and 13 leaders. These aren't just background characters, right? They are central figures actively driving the narrative forward. But to really understand how the text justifies these high-ranking roles, we actually have to go all the way back to the very beginning.
Which brings us to Section 2, Creation, Equality, and Ezar, specifically Image of God Equality.
In the Genesis creation hierarchy, the woman was created last, after the earth, man, garden, and animals, but she is positioned with image of God equality. However, the text assigns her a distinctly different role, describing her as a helper. Now, in modern English, helper kind of sounds subordinate, doesn't it? But translation absolutely matters here. The original Hebrew word translated as helper is Ezar. And Ezar is derived from the root word azar, which literally means to surround, protect, and aid. Think of it as a position of strength. The woman's role was not diminished or inferior at all. She was literally created as a protective aid.
So if that's the case, where does the historical tension between men and women come from? Well, the source points to the Genesis curse. The text says the woman's desire will be for her husband and he will rule over her. Let's look at the Hebrew word for desire here. It's teshuka, derived from a word meaning to run after or over. It essentially means a longing to overtake. And that word rule, it means to master or control. So what the text is actually saying is that a consequence of the fall is that husbands and wives will be at odds, basically locked in a power struggle. It totally reframes the whole concept of male dominance as a consequence of the fall, rather than the original intended design.
Moving right along to Section 3, Prophets, Leaders, and Heroines, and their historical roles.
Historically speaking, the early Jewish nation and the early Christian church elevated women way above the norms of the surrounding pagan cultures. A prime example of this elevated status is the role of the prophet. The text explicitly names women who held immense spiritual and cultural authority. We're talking righteous prophets like Miriam, Deborah, Huldah, and Anna. And actually, the text takes women so seriously that it holds them entirely accountable for wielding this power poorly, deliberately listing evil prophetesses like Noadiah and Jezebel. There's no doubt about it, women were undeniable spiritual heavyweights.
We also see this elevation in some really specific, fascinating historical anecdotes. Take the Old Testament, for example. Job utterly breaks societal rules and traditions by giving his daughters an equal inheritance right alongside his sons. Fast forward a few centuries, and you have the pagan philosopher Libanius marveling at the early church, literally exclaiming, "Heavens, what women you Christians have!" purely because of their self-control and character. Oh, and you know that famous Proverbs 31 passage about the perfect wife? Our source clarifies that it's actually a mother telling her son not to marry a lazy woman who ignores her ordained nature. It's not meant to be some impossible, stress-inducing standard of perfection for wives today.
Now for Section 4, the Women in Ministry Debate, looking at two perspectives.
Given everything we've just covered, you might be wondering, why is there so much modern tension surrounding women in church leadership? We're going to impartially weigh both biblical cases right now, looking purely at the proof texts. The absolutely crucial point here is that both sides draw directly from Scripture. The biblical case against women in ministry points out that Adam was created first, that Jesus called 12 male disciples, and that the requirements for deacons specifically state they must have one wife. On the flip side, the biblical case for women in ministry points to Galatians 3:28, which plainly declares men and women as co-heirs. It also points to that long list of female prophets we just talked about, and notes that early evangelists like Timothy were actually taught the faith by women, specifically his mother and grandmother.
To complicate things even further, what in the world do we do with the apparent inconsistencies in the Apostle Paul's instructions? I mean, he tells women to remain silent and ask their husbands questions at home. But what about single women who don't have husbands to ask? Paul says women shouldn't braid their hair or wear fine clothes, but then he talks about women praying and prophesying in church, which obviously requires talking. He mentions wearing veils and greeting with a holy kiss. Our source suggests Paul wasn't just being fundamentally chauvinistic here. Rather, he was likely telling the women of the early church to back off on their newfound freedoms, simply to avoid being culturally offensive to outsiders.
Now, to accurately and fully represent our source document, we really have to look at its perspective on modern society, too. The text argues that the feminist movement devalues women's uniqueness by, in some cases, attempting to turn them into men. The source asserts that the Bible encourages women primarily for their virtues rather than their careers, though it's quick to explicitly note that careers, sports, and politics are absolutely not forbidden for women.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Cultural versus Timeless Context.
So with all these varied verses, historical actions, and modern perspectives, how do we make sense of it all? I really want to pose this direct question to you. How should we interpret an issue when a historical text seems to contradict itself? Like when one verse says women should lead as prophets, and then another says they should be completely silent.
Well, our source actually gives us a really simple three-step test. Step 1, ask yourself, is the issue uniformly addressed throughout Scripture? Step 2, if yes, it's a cross-cultural, universal command. Step 3, if no, meaning if the verses offer competing ideas exactly like we see with women in leadership, then it's a context issue. It is highly likely a specific cultural instruction meant for a specific time and place, rather than a timeless, universal law.
We've covered some incredible ground today, from the hundreds of women actively named in the text to the fierce protective nature of the word Ezar, right through to the framework for understanding ancient cultural norms. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought. If interpretation completely hinges on cultural context, how much more might exploring the original Hebrew and Greek languages change your entire understanding of these ancient texts today? Keep digging, keep learning, and thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.